Okay, I'm talking with Kathy Peroff, who has spent a big part of her federal career in the Office of Management and Budget, and I think almost 30 years, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
I spent almost 20 years there. We started at the same time, and yet you're younger than I am. I don't quite understand how that arithmetic works.
Yeah.
But it seems to
Not
be the case.
Quite.
It's approximately correct. So you have having served at senior levels of OMB for most of that time, and through several presidencies and changes of leadership and director and so on, you have a pretty good sense of that institution and how it functions and how well it functions and the kind of people who work there and what it does for the president. Can you talk a little bit about OMB as an institution? How would you characterize its role in the government? How would you characterize what it contributes to the governing process?
Well, you know, when I first went to OMB, I thought I was going to stay about 3 years, and I stayed there almost 30. So I guess that says something about the place, in the sense that you're right at the center. You're part of the executive office of the president, and if you have an interest in policy and where policy interacts with politics at the highest levels, there's really no other place that, and also interacts with the issue of money and allocation of resources, obviously.
That's right. So you can see the whole process from where you are in that
right.
high-level perch.
High-level perspective.
And you can see it in real time as it
in
unfolds.
real time, and you get to meet a lot of interesting and talented people across the federal agencies and, of course, within the White House.
Mm-hmm.
What you don't get to do is, you know, run a program which has its own, I think, challenges and benefits. I never, you know, I worked in a federal agency for a while before I came to OMB, so I always valued that experience as well, about 6 years, because sometimes I think it's easy for discussions at OMB to become a little bit too high level, and when you've actually been in an agency and had to make something happen, it's a totally different challenge. That's why I think I've always been a big believer in people moving around a little bit, doing details in agencies in particular, and then coming back to OMB. There's a cross-fertilization that I think is really helpful for the government overall.
Well, that's an interesting observation. You are a political scientist, as am I, a student of government, and for a student of government, that's sort of the great place to be in order to really understand how the government works from the inside. Be able to see it all that unfold. And people who are outside the Beltway, especially in the heat of a political campaign, there's a sense that government is failing frequently, that we shouldn't trust the people who are running the government, sometimes not distinguishing between the political leadership in the Congress and the presidency and civil servants who work in the executive branch. But what is your reaction to that kind of public view of government?
Obviously, I spent my entire life in public service, and it was a very meaningful period for me, and I have no regrets. Just had tremendous opportunities to meet all kinds of people and to work on issues that were, you know, extraordinarily important, both on the domestic and the national security side. So,
what about the people at OMB?
I think that the people at OMB are in an extraordinary group, really talented, and there are all kinds of people. They're not just public policy, I mean, coming in with public policy backgrounds. There are people with Ph.D.s in chemistry. I had a Ph.D. in one of my staff in NSC, or National Security Division, I had a Ph.D. in physics, economics, business, health policy, depending on the kinds of portfolios that they were responsible for. So you have a diversity of backgrounds, and people who have made a choice to come to a place where they're not going to get rich, but where they're going to be working on some extraordinary issues. And they work hard and long hours. I think over time they work less hours at OMB than they used to, but they have their various Blackberries or
handheld devices,
iPhones, and they're working at home.
Yeah.
And so there's a big emphasis on nonpartisanship, on competence, on looking at all options, whatever the sort of goal is of the new administration that's coming in, speaking truth to power. It's a place where you feel good when you go to sleep at night. You don't feel like you've had to ever bend any of your values.
So that's part of the culture of the place. People make a real conscious effort all the time to give the full story and an accurate, balanced story on any issue to the leadership.
Absolutely.
And they're trying. It's sort of a paradox in a way. They're serving a partisan leader, and they're obviously trying to help that person of either party succeed. And when the president changes, shifting
sort of
gears a little bit.
Yes,
they're still
some
trying to
people
help
probably wonder how does that happen, or how does that really work?
Yeah.
But it does work. You have your political appointees coming in. They have their agendas, and they appreciate after, and maybe not right at the beginning. Sometimes there's a transition period where they have to learn about what OMB does and that we're trustworthy and we're not going to leak to the press or others. And once that trust is built up, and it usually builds up within a pretty short period of time, that relationship is a very wonderful thing, because there's a synergy there that somehow means we end up getting our president's budget together every year, and carry out the management agenda. I think the importance of making this point, that if someone really wants to be partisan and work for a particular party to carry out that party's agenda, they might be frustrated at OMB because you never know who's going to be the president. So whenever interviewing people, I would always say, okay, sometimes you're working for a Democrat and sometimes you're working for a Republican, and you have to be able to do that. But I think generally that is not maybe as hard as you might think it is. Because lots of times when it comes to issues about programs and money, there are lots and lots of constraints. Governing is a much different process than campaigning. You're all of a sudden in the world of gray and constraints and competing interests and different agendas on the Hill, and figuring out how you can move something along. And it's much more complicated, I think, than writing a policy piece and giving a speech.
Yeah. So say a little bit more about the work of OMB. What are some of the, people think of budgeting, of course, putting the president's budget together as the central task of the institution, but there's a lot more that goes on.
There's definitely a lot more.
In order to help the president
budget is just
succeed.
one thing that OMB does. As its title implies, it also has responsibility for management, and how we define what that management role is going to be varies considerably from administration to administration, much more so than that basic preparation of the budget. And probably that is one thing where there, some people feel that the management side is has always been somewhat of a stepsister, in the sense that it doesn't have that exactly same role and process from administration to administration. I'm probably in the category of thinking, maybe that's okay, because sometimes there are different ways to do management oversight, whether it's you know, I can remember during the first Bush administration under Director Darman, he set up what they called SWAT teams, where working together jointly with the agencies, OMB staff and agency staff worked together on particular management issues. And I can remember being on one of those teams working, looking at financial systems issues at HUD. That was, for me, that was a very good experience. And when we finished our report, we gave our briefing to both the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and to Darman and other advisors around the room. I thought that model worked pretty well. I also thought, you know, the President's management agenda process under the second Bush administration worked pretty well. Very, very different. So, you know, I'm not so sure it has to be exactly the same.
Yeah. It helps to have high-level presidential
The
attention,
most important thing is high-level attention. If you don't have high-level attention, the institution is not going to have attention. And I can't say that enough. I'm probably not a big, you know, proponent one way or the other of particular organizational setups. You know, some people say, well, we need a management czar in addition to the OMB deputy. I'm not so sure about that. I think it should, you know, if the president doesn't care and the director doesn't care, then we've got, you know, it's hard to make management oversight work. They have to really care about those things. And as well, I think what we call the program associate directors, these are the political appointees who have responsibility for agencies or clusters of agencies. They've got to care. And sometimes that's been, I think, an issue. They see themselves as primarily just budget, and I think that's really...
It tends to be their background. They're
It-
policy
yeah, it's
people,
part
they're
of their
budget
problem,
people, but they're not
their
management
background.
types.
You know, that I think is something that really has to be examined. Your face to the agency has to be both your budget management face has to be one face, and that's my particular view.
Well, I want to come back to this question in a few minutes of how to make OMB an even more effective organization than it is. But since you've spanned this series of administrations and you've seen OMB as an institution change over time, can you talk about some of the ways it's changed? It's always had, during this full period of time, going back I think to almost the 70s, it's had about the same number of staff. It's about 500 staff, more or less, year to year. So it's a very small organization.
Yes, it is.
In bureaucratic terms.
Yes.
And it's had about the same budget. If you adjust for inflation, it's about $100 million
Right.
budget every year, today's dollars. So it hasn't changed in a superficial way. It's the same organization as it was 30 years ago, 25 years ago. But it has evolved over time, and it's been given more and more to do, right? It seems like always
Yes.
new legislative requirements, new things that are thought up that only OMB can be asked to do, it seems, or to lead.
Yes, I think that's where that's a challenge for the institution right there. What you've said.
So was it very different when you started than it is today as an institution, or is there continuity?
I think that the biggest change in OMB since I started there is the decrease in the amount of time for thinking long-term, doing analysis, and that, I think, is a sad thing. I don't think that's a healthy thing.
What's squeezed it out?
And
What are they doing more of?
What has squeezed it out would be, one, maybe the proliferation of duties, both statutory and otherwise.
So there's been a series of statutes enacted that have, like
Right.
the Chief Financial Officer's statute and various IT
Right.
management requirements and so on.
Right.
Just layer new responsibilities
Freedom of
on
Information
OMB.
Act requirements.
Right. Right.
And secondly, the 7/24-hour media environment in which the White House lives.
Hmm.
The demands that has created on the White House complex has certainly impacted OMB.
Hmm.
As the Deputy Associate Director for Defense, I was getting a lot of phone calls from our communications office about, there's a reporter saying this, and they've got a deadline of X, and they need an answer now. A lot of that was coming in, and that can break up your day very fast. And so, to some extent, I pushed back. We all pushed back a little bit. But the communications people would counter that. If you get a bad news story, if it gets out there for more than 24 hours, we've lost the story.
Yeah.
And so we had a lot of interesting discussions about how to handle the inquiries coming in from the reporters, and often then follow-on ones coming in from the Hill that were stimulated by the story.
So they weren't just asking you for information, they were asking you to help shape the story, or what?
They were asking for information. Is this true? Is it not true? And these are little anecdotes. You've got to really dig in. You've got to go to the agency and understand what's going on.
But they wouldn't go right to DOD. They
Well,
come to OMB
we
because
tried to
OMB is
push
part
them
of
to
the
go to the
President's
agencies
office.
to do this, and
Okay.
they became a little bit better, but that is some training that will have to occur at the beginning of each administration.
Yeah.
Because they like coming to the OMB staff, because the OMB staff are fast. They'll respond pretty quickly,
Right.
and they sort of have a sense of how to answer a question that the press office likes.
Right.
They'll go to the agency, sometimes they get, they'll get a book rather than a paragraph.
Mhm.
But I think that is just something that's got to be managed, because that is, I understand the demands and requirements of that.
It's driving out time for analysis and digging into
It
how
is,
programs work,
definitely,
or going
yes.
out in the field
Definitely
and
doing
looking
that.
at how things are
And
working.
then on top of that, some of the work with the policy councils has taken away.
Policy councils, the Domestic Policy Council, National Security
I'm
Council,
talking
the
about the
National
Domestic
Economic
Policy
Council,
Council, the National Security Council, the Environmental Quality, Council on
CEQ.
Environmental
Right.
Quality, and particularly in the national security world where I worked, your NSC staff has, I don't know what the staffing size is right now, but it's the size of OMB almost.
Yeah, I heard that.
Which is, I think, something that should be.
A lot of those people are detailed from the Pentagon?
Most of those people are detailed from either DOD, state, or the intelligence community,
Mm-hmm.
which I think sets up an interesting dynamic, actually. It should be examined in more detail, but National Security Council's, director and National Security Advisor likes obviously having a big staff. So anyway, that is, I think, an interesting transition issue. But they have lots and lots of meetings. OMB likes to be present because some of those issues have all sorts of implications for programs and budgets.
Mm-hmm.
But that eats up a lot of time. So you're integrated into the policy process. That's a good thing, but it can also take away a lot of time. There were days when I was just in one meeting after another, and you're trying to sometimes decide how important is this particular meeting. But if you're not present, your absence is noted, and so you're always making these difficult choices.
Yeah.
So I think the decline in the longer term or analytic effort, has come, probably almost unconsciously or organically as a result of OMB's being plugged in more into that policy process with these other councils, being plugged into the media response environment, and queries coming in from Congress too. I mean, the number of letters are coming in from the Congress,
Right.
but that
Increase.
takes time.
So there's some irony in that there's a general trend to encourage agencies to develop evidence as a basis for their policies, to monitor their performance, to report on their performance, measure things, to be more analytical, in other words, in the way they
Yes,
function.
yes.
And here you have the central analytical staff for the president who is pressured not to be, to the point that they don't have as much time as they used to have to sort of say, you know, what would be a different way of approaching this problem? But how could we use resources very differently to try to solve this problem than the way we're doing it now? So they tend to just don't have the time. That's a little ironic situation.
Well,
And
I
they-
suppose, you know, there are different options. One is you increase the number of staff at OMB, probably not gonna happen.
Mhm.
A second might be that you really start restructuring some of the work
Mhm.
of OMB. We've never been successful at identifying lower priorities.
Mhm.
But I think there are some lower priorities. And it may be, for example, that we don't need, and I'm sure I'll be shocked after I say these things if anybody sees this, but we may not need an examiner for every single little program in the
Mhm.
federal government.
Right.
You know, or we just give it very cursory review.
Right.
We tolerate that risk
Mhm.
in order to address greater risks that we're not addressing now.
Right.
Maybe we don't spend as much time, getting into some of the really small programmatic issues in every single agency. It's just I mean, that's sort of the same thing. If you're not examining them in that kind of detail, you don't need to attend all of, you know, or have elaborate budget hearings on some of these programs.
Yeah.
Maybe we, we take a lighter touch on our review of testimony coming over from the agencies that's about to be given,
Yeah.
or documents that are to be sent as reports by the agencies. We give them a lighter review. Maybe we don't even review some of them.
Well,
So there's less control of the message. There'll be some things that go up to the hill that maybe, the administration would prefer didn't, but OMB, they hopefully, if we've done this right, wouldn't be major issues.
Mhm.
And we would have staff then able to focus more on bigger issues.
There have been a series of efforts to look at OMB and how it's functioning and to see if there are ways to improve it. And there was actually a reorganization effort in the Clinton years. OMB 2000 was called, but it was done in 1994, I believe. And that addressed one of the common, recurring, I should say, complaints about OMB, which is that the budget process and the management process are in separate silos.
Yes.
They compete for resources, as probably is
Absolutely.
a bit of an oversimplification. And the budget process tends to dominate and to squeeze the management side, so there's not enough
Mhm.
attention to implementation policies. And the OMB reorganization in 1994 attempted to combine the M and the B.
Mhm.
Actually moved management staff,
Right.
reassigned them to the previous budget branches to create so-called RMOs, resource
Right.
management organizations, which would see their
Right.
responsibility as
Right.
a continuum from
Right.
developing policy and budget proposals to implementing those proposals and making sure that the agency is properly
Right.
executed and carried them out so that you got the results that you wanted or sought after. How did that reorganization affect OMB as an institution? And did
Well,
it
I
stick,
think
or is it?
I am one who believes that was a move in the right direction.
Mhm.
I don't think it went far enough, because ultimately the decision was made that we wouldn't integrate completely because we weren't going to do anything that required legislative change. so that some of the individual management entities did not become integrated. And I would probably go further and, you know, integrate them really. So I just think that that is one way to get around this issue of M being inferior to B. To me, it's just, it's almost a false distinction. These are two oversight functions that have to work together, and people
they can reinforce each other. Right?
Have to reinforce each other, and our leaders of OMB, both the political leaders and the SES leaders, have to be held accountable in their performance evaluations for their work on both of those. And I'm willing to acknowledge that there are different ways to do the M part of that, whether it's, you know, performance evaluations or evidence-based initiatives, or you know, PART or PMAs, Presence Management Agenda. All of those were
the RMOs were very much involved in the presence management agenda, not just the budget side.
You know, they're called budget analysts, but or RMO analysts now. I mean, they think, if you talk to any of my analysts in NSD, that they were doing, you know, good management stuff. But when things break down, it's because there still are some silos, and that integration doesn't happen, communication doesn't happen, or it happens after the fact when some decisions have been made. So, you know, and then you can build up ill will within your institution, as small as we are, and sometimes that has happened. So, yeah, integration is really important.
Apparently, it's still a problem or an issue for many people.
It is.
Because there was a new report came out in October of 2016.
Yes.
Which is when we're talking.
Yes.
It just came out from the Partnership for Public Service, which criticizes the agency for still being too siloed, that people tend to stay in their silos, especially the M silo or the B silo.
That's, and I agree with that.
And also for being caught up in too many low priority matters, which I think you would help.
Not everybody can agree what those low priority matters are. That's been one of our challenges. But I think that's where leadership comes in.
Yeah, and the third part of their critique, as I read it, is that OMB's culture is sometimes to say no to agencies, to try to critique and block them rather than to being more facilitative or supportive.
I'm not sure I agree so much with that, and I realize that was one of the messages there. You know, everybody can disagree with me on this, but I actually saw, in all of my years there, I did see some of that no business. Yes, I'm not going to say it never exists, but I saw more often than not just the opposite, where OMB staff were often, I mean, working with their agencies to, you know, whatever the issue was, it was much more collaborative. And I think it had become, and has become, much more collaborative over time.
Yeah, the agencies I knew, but sometimes OMB's role was to say, why can't you do it this way? Try something new that you've been beating your head against the wall.
Absolutely.
Let's try something different.
You know, and then I'll also cite one of those people I admire greatly, Alice Rivlin, who said, I mean, let's not forget, somebody has to say no, because there's always more demand for resources than available.
Which sounds like an economist.
So, at some point, I mean, that's what OMB also does, and so, you know, we can, you know, call the director Dr. No or whatever, but, I mean, that's also ultimately going to be part of what he or she does. And believe me, on the big issues, the president's very involved. So, you know, OMB will sort of be the face for some of those tough decisions. But
so we agree on part of the critique, at least, with the partnership report, which is there is still some siloing going on within OMB, small as it is. And even though people talk a lot,
yes, there
across
is.
These silos, it's fairly easy to reach across.
Absolutely. To some extent, that's, you know, some leadership on both sides, the B&M that
Yeah.
maybe could have worked on that more.
Yeah. Well, here's what they say, you know, I'm just quoting from, or summarizing their report, as I understand it. Here's some areas where OMB could improve. One is pay more attention to the implementation of policies. Help the president and the White House
Policy
pay
or
more-
programs or
policies, programs,
Okay.
that is follow through, make sure that
right,
when something is passed and funded, that it doesn't, the work doesn't just stop there, the oversight doesn't stop there, that you make sure the agencies are actually effectively implementing. And implementation, of course, has been a big issue for some major initiatives recently, like the healthcare initiative. So maybe OMB has a role to play in helping implement it. That's one.
Could I address that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Theoretically, I agree with that. But let's keep in mind, we have an agency of 450, 500 people.
Mm-hmm.
The Office of Policy at the Department of Defense is 800. What you can do in terms of oversight on a particular program in an agency that's got hundreds, thousands of them, where really getting into the implementation of a program means, I think, a deep dive.
Yeah.
There are just basic limitations there.
Right.
So I think I would describe it differently. It would be, OMB should be, and I think we were, at least I was trying to do this, requiring evaluations of programs, if a new program was being set up or proposed in legislation, putting in a requirement for an evaluation that would be submitted at a certain time and then submitted to OMB and the Congress and others. Yes, there can, we should, I'm not disagreeing with this, I'm just saying,
Yeah.
let's be
There's
aware of
a
the basic
fundamental,
constraints here. I think
limitation of
the
human
agencies
resources.
have to be the lead on implementation.
Right.
And their leadership has to be the lead on making sure that implementation is going on. OMB will come in and pick and choose and look at certain programs, but we can't, I think, just the numbers don't allow it.
So easy to say, hard to decide
Well,
where to put your
exactly.
resources to really affect
Exactly.
implementation
Right.
and not lose track of all the other important missions, including these other targets for improvement, according to this report. One is OMB is a logical organization at the top of the bureaucracy to facilitate interagency cooperation, coordination. And so many of the major policy initiatives of any administration are going to involve multiple programs across multiple agencies,
Yes.
and it is always problematic to get agencies to work together.
Yeah.
Say it's border security, you get the Department of
Yeah.
Homeland Security and Justice Department,
Yes.
the
Yeah.
courts all in the same orchestra at
This
least.
one I agree with, and I know how hard it is.
It's hard.
Having
and that,
worked on it.
And that would be a
Many
big,
different kinds of cross.
that could be a big assignment.
It's a huge assignment.
Well, what about intergovernmental coordination? We used to have institutions that paid attention to the federal, state, local relationships and that collected data and did
They
analysis.
don't pay as much attention to
and
that
those,
anymore.
they're gone.
They're gone.
And OMB at one time historically had
Yes.
an Office of
We had-
Intergovernmental Affairs.
I don't know how,
Uh,
I know we had them,
But now
most of
it's
them were
not there.
gone by the time I got there, but yes, that's gone.
So that could be something that OMB could take on as a new responsibility. What about fostering innovation across the federal government? This is another recommendation of this report, that OMB could do more to make the bureaucracy more agile and innovative, and adopting new practices and techniques.
That sounds nice.
Mhm.
I don't, for me personally, is that something I think is the top priority of OMB? I would say probably not. That should be coming from the agencies.
Another.
However,
Yeah.
however, I have been involved in several kinds of what you would call innovative things. Sometimes it was in bringing two different agencies together to work on a particular issue, and so I'm not saying no to it, but again, how much time do you put into innovation? Innovation is really important, but sometimes I think that, again, knowing where the opportunities for innovation are really depends on having a lot of knowledge of the programs and how they're working. Being there at sort of ground zero, that's what, that's the agencies. So I don't have that high on my list. I probably wouldn't agree with him as much.
OMB also, again, quoting from the report, should lead on the development of information and evidence and its application in the decision-making process and in management of programs. We have a wealth of information, but it's kind of locked up in databases, and a lot of people have recognized that there's opportunity there to integrate administrative databases, to build a body of evidence through that way, and also by evaluating programs over time, as you described, so that we actually have enough evidence about what works and what doesn't work to steer the ship a bit better, both at the budget through the budget process and in the way programs are implemented. Do you think that OMB should do more in that area?
Yes, I would support that. I guess, though, I would say this. I would put it more generically. OMB should always be, have as its priority, creating or encouraging more information than we currently have about how programs are working, getting evidence, getting real data on outcomes. If I think about the one frustration that I had throughout my years, it was a constant, how often such data were not available. Or the data that were available were not very apropos to the particular decision that had to be made.
It's frustrating.
And that was a common finding across domestic and national security programs. So I always used to, I think I told you this once and sort of half in jest, but I would have loved to have had access to a pot of funds that OMB could have used to have studies done, by outside groups or laboratories, FFRDCs, on particular policy or program issues that would address some of the questions that we had. Of course, nobody ever wanted to give us that kind of money, but.
And the final recommendation or set of recommendations in this report is, again, to integrate the management and budget sides of OMB.
I agree with that.
And how would that be done? I mean, we tried it. It was tried in 1994, as I said, and that didn't stay. And since then, there have been more statutory offices.
I think there are two ways.
created.
One is you can, do a really radical reorganization of OMB and requires some legislation. So you might get rid of OFPP, the Office of Procurement Policy.
Right.
And some of these other small offices, and take all those people and put them into these budget management units.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you would have a separate organization that has both budget management types that are sort of your in-house consulting people that sort of move around working on big issues.
That's good.
I've always liked that idea.
Yeah.
I would have liked to have been in that kind of organization, so you can
Right.
work around the federal government on different issues, and I think increase learning within OMB that way. So I think, I haven't given it a lot of thought, but I would probably, if I, were king for the day or queen for the day, that would be something I would really want to look at.
So,
But, organizational change like that takes a long energy. A lot of energy, a lot of bureaucratic resistance, Hill resistance. And so the question will be whether the new director is going to be willing to consider that. Failing that, I think within the existing organizational structure, there's some flexibilities that you have to reorganize. I also think that there's got to be a cultural change at the very top about the importance of M and B and their being integrated.
Very
I can't
top
tell
meaning.
you how often I heard my pad say that I don't care about that stuff.
Right.
It's not important. Now, in fairness to that pad, and it wasn't just one, it was because they felt that they weren't significant enough issues, that there were really major other kinds of program management kinds of issues that should have been focused on.
Is it also a question of urgency? That is, imagine some issues have to be dealt with during the half-life of a director or an associate director, which is typically 2-3 years.
Yeah.
And so it may not be a priority for them to figure out how to solve the management problems of DOD or some other agency that are going to be there long after they're gone.
Well, I
they
think
may have
that's
to deal with
a
some
very
immediate
good
crisis.
point, and it's maybe suggests the need for having an office that just focuses on longer term issues.
Right.
I mean, when you think of the fact that, and there's a statistic out there, like about over the next 10 years, 76% of all spending will be outside the appropriations process.
Mm-hmm. It's there now.
It's coming from all of our entitlement programs that are just on autopilot.
If you add in tax expenditures, it's even higher percentage already.
So,
That's over
I mean,
$1
that's a
trillion.
pretty,
Yeah.
just think about that.
Mhm.
We are spending all of this time and energy on,
Yeah.
that's a quarter
Yeah. Right.
of the total resources of our federal government that, going out, and
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't make sense. And this is what bothers me. I mean, so there needs to be a place in OMB, and maybe this is, again, not just economists.
Yeah.
Excuse me, because sometimes I think they get very, you need economists, you need other kinds of analysts coming together and looking at some of these longer term issues, because we really do have a long term debt issue. You know, I know that there are some economists out there publicly saying that the debt isn't an issue. Okay, short term, maybe not such an issue, but longer term, it really is an issue. I think OMB needs to provide more leadership on that issue.
So what advice would you give a new director when she or he takes over OMB in January of 2017? Should they spend time on OMB as an institution and trying to make it even more robust and so it can do even more of these great things that are being recommended, or should they, as a member of the President's cabinet and a senior advisor to the President and being responsible for turning the President's priorities into legislation and budget and so on, should they spend all their energy, as they typically do, on those immediate tasks? And if they don't pay attention to the institution because they're not going to be there long enough or they don't have time,
Yeah, I know.
who
I
can
guess
do that?
I would tell the director, you've got the PPS report, you've got the OMB strategic review that I worked on under Sylvia Matthews. Look at those. Talk to a few people. It might be, in my view, would be worth appointing somebody, your staff, your political staff, to look at this and come up with a set of recommendations on things you can do that require legislation, that don't require, and that address some of these concerns. Yes, I think I would do that. Obviously, the director has got too much going on. He's gonna have to delegate that to somebody who he or she really cares about, and, I mean, not cares about, but trusts to do
Right,
that.
right. So, in the
You would be good for that.
I'm retired.
Yeah.
In the period just ahead, the transition period, OMB takes on a special role. They're talking to the current occupants of those positions in the White House and in OMB and the agencies. And then they're also beginning to talk to a new cast of characters. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like to go through a presidential transition, having been through several, and OMB's particular importance during that period of time, that sort of twilight between administrations?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a very creative and chaotic time. I think you know, one of the things that I found is that in spite of all of the papers that have been written on transition and giving advice,
Mm-hmm.
at least the people that came into OMB, most of them didn't seem to have read them or paid much attention to them.
Sadly.
So, there's just OMB staff play a very important educational role.
Yeah.
And
They have the institutional memory when everyone else is
the
gone,
institutional
right?
memory when everybody is gone, and the extent to which they do that well, then they gain the trust of the people that come in. So it's really important that they do that well, that they don't look like they have particular agendas. And I think that in general, OMB staff have always done that very well, from everything I observed. Most of these people just have no idea about what OMB really is like, and so there's that tremendous education process that has to occur, and it'll start, you know, the day after the election, actually, hopefully. So that educational process, you know, and whether it's a lot of written papers, sometimes OMB staff write reams and reams of papers, and again, I don't know, I have a feeling a lot of those aren't read either. I think short and sweet is better, and then just really punchy briefings.
Right.
And, you know, it's also the case that a lot of these people come in like to learn just by doing. I've heard that so many times when people go, oh, I'll just learn by doing, you know. Have the stuff come to me and I'll learn that way. Which actually isn't a good thing. I think it's really important for them to have the overall framework, and they understand OMB and all the functions and how it all works, and where there's some room for improvement. And I think especially if there is a desire to maybe make some changes in OMB, to make it a little bit more cutting edge, relevant, efficient, that then has to be part of that message early on.
Yeah.
That's not going to be the interest in dealing with changing OMB is not going to be at the top of their agenda. So it may be that you make the pitch, but it ends up that they just, you know, we have too many other things that we want to do. I think you know, it's also important to get across the notion that, you know, it's a nonpartisan type of institution serving the president. And I could just remember in several conversations I had with new people coming in, they found that hard to understand, especially if they come from the Hill.
Yeah, where everyone who's hired is hired by some political person for a political job. Yeah.
So,
except for CBO, which
you know, and they're viewing you in the context of the fact that you've just been working with the previous administration, and if there's a change in administration, this becomes a much bigger sort of trust issue.
Yeah.
What was your question? Are there any? I can't remember. We were talking about transition.
Well, here's my next and final question. So you spent a long time at OMB. Do you have any regrets about, you could have done something different, you started out as an academic.
Yes, I did.
You came into government and you stuck.
Yes, I did. I was in academia.
Yeah.
No, I do not have any regrets.
Yeah. It's a
I
demanding
really
job.
enjoyed, as I said earlier, being at that nexus
Yeah.
of policy, money, politics,
Yeah.
and I like I guess I'm one that sort of likes the speed. Now, I don't want it, too crazy, but
Mhm.
it, the
And-
turnaround has an appeal to me.
Yeah.
Things are, by the time issues come to OMB, they're pretty big issues.
Yeah.
You can't just wait forever to sort of resolve them because,
Right.
they've already sort of been through that process. So
It's very demanding, sometimes exhausting work, right?
it can be exhausting, yes.
At the same time, it's exciting.